People taking the wrong message from things is a pretty major pet peeve of mine, at least as a former teacher. And I think Game of Thrones is a very interesting example to examine in that specific arena, because not only does the world seem to have taken a number of the wrong messages from Game of Thrones as a show, I think Game of Thrones took a number of the wrong messages, not only from the text upon which it is based, but from itself and its early success. One key phrase has become synonymous with the writing style of the show Game of Thrones, and because the show is so popular, that has also been applied retroactively to Martin's masterful text. That phrase is subverting expectations. When a viewer is anticipating a story to go one direction, but it swerves and does something else. While this does happen in Martin's story, how it happens is fundamentally misunderstood, not only by many people who watched Game of Thrones, but by the showrunners themselves. Life is full of surprises. Unexpected things happen all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that unexpected things coming out of nowhere in a book necessarily feels the same, feels realistic, or feels good for a narrative. Because when we are receiving a TV show or a book or a movie, we're receiving a narrative through a lens directed at us by the author, the director, the writer, what have you. And in each of those instances, we, the audience, are being fed very specific information that is building up this kind of larger mosaic image of the story that is trying to be told. Where we have things that are completely left turn shifts, it feels as though that mosaic has been completely off for a very long time. It can be very satisfying at various points, but overall, it can very much disrupt the narrative. Well, yes, in life, unexpected things happen. In a narrative, there's this relationship of trust that is effectively being built up between the writer and the audience, and subverting too frequently oftentimes can kind of detract from that relationship of trust, unless you do it how George R. R. Martin does. When George R. R. Martin opts to surprise his audience, it never comes fully out of nowhere. There's always some basis for some massive twist or event that happens. The famous example is the Red Wedding. There's an excellent video by Hello Future Me on why this is a masterful subversion on so many levels, but it is an event that is so truly rooted in the core character actions that are taken in the three books leading up to it. Robb Stark and Catelyn Stark are our main kind of views on this conflict. Catelyn, of course, being a viewpoint, and then in the show, getting more of Robb's individualized perspective. But in both instances, this is something that is being yielded from specifically Robb's choice. His choice to send Theon to the Iron Islands that ends up costing him the North. His choice to abandon his marriage to the Freys, which ultimately lays the groundwork for this foundational betrayal. All of it is true to the character, and all of it makes sense if we're looking at it retroactively. Let's take a look at another example of subverting expectations from Game of Thrones, though this one doesn't occur in the books. Arya killing the Night King sucks on pretty much every imaginable level. It makes no sense. Well, yes, it does come out of nowhere and subvert the viewer's expectations. This subversion ends up completely cutting the story off at the knees, given the fact that the White Walkers had been built up for 8 seasons at this point as the evil force in the show. So many mysteries surrounded them, and so many other players had elements interacting with that arc, most notably Jon Snow, as well as several others. Arya spent the entire story removed from the North, learning how to be an assassin, and yeah, while being an assassin makes you good at killing people, I don't know why it would have anything to do with her killing the Night King here. But specifically, going back to that retroactive lens, there is something that David and Dan kind of tried to do to say, oh, we foreshadowed this, when it's very clear that that is not the case, and this is just completely being pulled out of their asses. There's a scene in, I believe, season 3 where Arya and Melisandre meet for some reason, and Melisandre says that Arya is going to close blue eyes, brown eyes, yada yada yada. The blue eyes in that vision are sort of retroactively used as saying, oh, Arya is going to kill the blue eyes of the White Walkers, all of them at the same time, because that's how that works, apparently. But that seems to be a post hoc ergo proctor hoc explanation, given the fact that it is coming so long after, and there's literally no other foreshadowing that Arya would kill the Night King. Because something happened in the future, this thing in the past has to have been the cause of it, or some direct foreshadowing of it, rather than just being some throwaway line that they thought, oh, we can foreshadow with this, even though we have no clue who these people are. I've stated several times in the past that I believe the Red Wedding is what killed Game of Thrones. It is undoubtedly the best and most successful scene as an adaptation in the entirety of the series, and it's obviously iconic in so many ways, but I think it drove David and Dan down a kind of dark road fueled by egotism. This was a fantastic scene, and they were getting all of the credit. They wrote the episode, they've created this series. It was all them, and they focused on the idea that the main thing that people wanted, the main thing that people liked about this sequence is how surprising it is. Whereas I think that the stronger element of the Red Wedding is how well founded it is in the characters themselves and the actions they've taken in the story leading up to it. If it had just come out of nowhere and been for nothing, it really wouldn't make sense, and I think it would have left a much more sour taste in people's mouth overall. The death of Ned Stark is also a sort of microcosm of this incident and was really the first instance of subverting expectations being a factor in Ice and Fire or in Game of Thrones as a whole. Ned's death is something that is inherently shocking. He is the protagonist figure for the first book and the first season, but it is done in such a way where it completely and totally makes sense. Joffrey is completely irrational. He is going to cut off Ned's head just to have this political move that ends up destroying pretty much everything, and ultimately it does make sense for the character, because if we look at the text in retrospect, Ned Stark is much more clearly this kind of mentor father figure to all of the individual viewpoint characters rather than being the protagonist himself. It works because if you look back on it, it is clear that this is the direction the story was headed from the beginning, even if that wasn't the case at the initial time when this surprise occurred. I also want to ask, what do you think is the best moment of surprise from either the books or the show? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. While you're down there, leave a like and subscribe. I know for me, when I was reading the books for the first time, Stoneheart was not something I had heard about. She was pretty much the only element of the story that I wasn't spoiled on whatsoever. So seeing her reveal at the end of A Storm of Swords completely floored me like nothing else I've seen before. But it is so well established by Beric Dondarrion coming back to life and his vow to Arya to help her family. It's really interesting and I really liked it. When we look at some of the middle seasons of Game of Thrones, we see the beginning of this process take shape as some of these moments from the later books begin to be adapted into the series, but David and Dan are forgetting the ways in which they have to earn these moments of subversion. Look at Jon's death, for one example, this massive mutiny at the Night's Watch that ultimately leads to the Lord Commander's death. In the show, there is some build up to it. It's mostly focused around allowing the wildlings through the wall, and while that is a big part of the conflict at the wall in the text, there are so many other elements happening and going around, and so many different interests and so many different people involved in this conspiracy, each for different reasons, that the show just completely disregards. All of these people like Bo and Marsh are just completely erased, and other factors that play a key role just don't appear whatsoever. The Pink Letter appears like a season later after Jon is already brought back from the dead, whereas in the text, it is this massive moment that ends up causing the mutiny pretty directly within its same chapter. So I don't think that it wasn't an instant slide, as some people might think it is. It isn't that just season 8 is bad. The show very much started losing the lessons that it had learned in its early seasons as it progressed, and crucially, as it gained more critical success. I think the more that happened, the more it went to David and Dan's heads. I also think that the concept in and of itself started to eat away at Game of Thrones. Once the showrunners got it in their heads that subverting expectations was something the show is known for, they started to do it for its own sake and started trying to kind of amplify things, continually do things that are bigger and better and more unexpected. But what they ended up doing was getting further and further away from what people actually liked about the Red Wedding. Subversion for subversion's sake really doesn't matter, and it just rings more and more hollow as it continues to happen and happen and happen. This happens with a lot of other shows, as shows that are known for realism, for kind of subverting the viewer's expectations, are kind of developing that reputation. Once that gets to a point, it just kind of starts to feel repetitive, especially if the showrunners are very clearly just trying to keep the audience hooked, regardless of any kind of thought given to the story throughout. I've talked a lot about The Walking Dead in recent videos, mostly the comics, but in this instance, I want to talk about the show because I think it's another example of an adaptation that got in its own head with the idea of being realistic and subverting viewer expectations. Because when we get into some of the, I guess it's mid seasons, later for me, I stopped watching after like season 7, but when we look at seasons like 7 and 8, we see continual amplification that really doesn't have any point to it whatsoever. Spoilers for The Walking Dead if you care about that at all, but when we see Negan killing both Abraham and Glenn, it seems to kind of trying to be one-upping its comic counterpart for no real reason. The creator, Kirkman, has said he regrets killing Abraham, and there's a lot of interesting things that could have been done with either character had they outlived their comic counterpart and actually changed the kind of direction of the show, but instead they're both killed off for shock value after a cliffhanger that was also for shock value. And then also the death of Carl Grimes seems to be very similar in terms of just killing a character off for the sake of, oh, we can kill this character off, nobody is safe, yada yada. This is still an interesting show, I promise. Though I know there are also some contractual disputes going on with Carl's actor, but I digress. That's neither here nor there. The two shows that I've brought up, Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead, kind of represent two different endpoints for this kind of betrayal of the audience, this subverting expectations merely for its own sake, just to shock them. With Game of Thrones, the most egregious examples of subverting expectations come in its final seasons. Things like Arya killing the Night King, Daenerys' heel turn to madness, everything that happens in the final episode. All of this happens at the very finish line of the entire series, and I think it's reflected very heavily in the show's legacy. People don't talk as much about the good parts of Game of Thrones because it was so bad at the end. That is how the series is remembered, that show with the terrible ending. Whereas The Walking Dead, I think it more represented itself in this kind of betrayal of trust again and again and again, and we saw the viewership just drop off a cliff given the fact that it was happening towards what I think is the middle of the series, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that overall the legacy of The Walking Dead is affected in a very similar way, but overall that happened much earlier and shows that kind of the unintended effects that can come of it if it happens earlier on in a series, as compared to the final season of Game of Thrones. Though I will say the final two seasons of Game of Thrones, other than the final season, so 6 and 7, if I could say that clearly without making everything very confusing, are also not great and have a lot of weird subversions as well, but overall they're not as egregious for general audiences as the last season. This video was partially inspired by a tweet I saw about the new It series. Specifically, the creator of that series compares the first episode to The Red Wedding. I believe they said, "We love it, it's our Red Wedding." I don't think that it's possible to have a Red Wedding in the first episode of a series. The Red Wedding, as I've said, relies on established events to create that masterful moment of shock. There are no past events for this to reference, aside from, I guess, the It movies, but overall, I don't think there's really a way to do that between series and really have it be cohesive, especially for people who might be coming in to this series fresh. The reason I'm making this video, and the thing that has annoyed me to the point of ranting for however many minutes I've been doing this at this point, it's been more than you've gotten. I've taken several takes on several of these. But regardless, it's an issue to me that the main legacy of Game of Thrones, the lesson that people seem to take from it, is to subvert expectations, when that is not the meaning of Martin's writing whatsoever. Yes, Martin subverts viewer expectations and plays with tropes and inverts certain things, but I think that there are much more crucial elements to his work. The main thing, the heart of it for me, is that Martin writes about humanity. He always says the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. All of his characters are individually human, and they each have flaws, they each have strengths, they each have weaknesses, all of these things that coalesce to make them feel like a real person. The chapters we have from each perspective feels like we are actually in that person's head, and we are very much being walked through why they're making the decisions they do, though they often lead to disastrous results, like the Red Wedding. If anything, I feel like the main lesson that should be learned from Game of Thrones, the show, is that audience trust can be built with excellent work, excellent writing, excellent characters, but it takes a while to do. And all of that can be burned away in an instant, and ultimately, all the people remember is the horrifying fire rather than whatever it might have burned down. I know this is probably coming out right after Halloween, but I know I've saved the real scary stuff for right now, given that I'm talking about the show. I don't normally like doing that. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it, and it does really help grow the channel. And many more for you in the very near future on Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, and A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which I keep forgetting. It's only like 2 months now, I think, until it comes out. So, man, I am really looking forward to it. So I hope you'll join me then. I appreciate any support. Thank you. Goodbye.